Hello, and welcome back for another video on this little corner of the internet. Today I wanted to make a video talking to you about all of the books that I read in the month of February. In total, I read 10 books in February. 4 of those were graphic novels. I usually do a separate graphic novel roundup, but I figured since I only read 4 this past month, I might as well include it in my overall wrap-up. If you aren't interested in hearing about graphic novels, I will leave the timestamp for where I start talking about the fiction books on the screen, and you can jump to that. But if you are interested in hearing about the 4 graphic novels that I read in February, buckle up because we have some things to talk about. First off, let's talk about The Blouse by Bastien Vive. I think that's how you say his name. He's French. I would really love to have the brain cells that I lost reading this graphic novel back, please. Personally, I think it is safe for me to say that this is the worst graphic novel that I have ever read in my life. This was originally published in 2018 and translated into English and published in the US in 2022, so last year. And right up front, I will say that this is easily the most misogynistic and objectifying piece of literature, period, that I have read in quite a while. Our female protagonist is a college student who kind of blends in with the crowd. Not many people notice her until one evening she puts on a magic silk blouse and her life changes. The magic of the blouse is that it emphasizes her boobs, and suddenly every man within a 5-mile radius is knocking at her door, which apparently means that her life is therefore on an upward swing from where it once was. Her personality rapidly shifts from someone who is very quiet, kind of nerdy, very shy, to just downright bitchy and obnoxious and a femme fatale caricature. She then goes on to have multiple affairs with older men, ignores her shitty boyfriend, and starts chain smoking cigarettes. The car window scene. The car window scene. There's a scene in this graphic novel where she is waiting in the car for her older lover to come back from getting something, and there's this random guy that walks by her car window and stares at her boobs and then promptly starts jerking off to them in public. Instead of doing something reasonable like telling him off or calling the police, she finds this very attractive and starts to get herself off to him getting himself off. It's, oh, Christ, like, I can't make this stuff up. I can't. The pinnacle and the message of this story, from what I could quite clearly tell, was that the main character's life rapidly, quote-unquote, improves when she becomes openly desirable to men, when she becomes openly sexually available to them, and that being depicted as the peak of womanhood. This story definitely embodies the male gaze and objectification in its purest state. And I felt like I needed to take a shower after having read this book. It was vile. I think I gave it the lowest possible rating on Storygraph, which is 0.25 out of 5 stars. A slight improvement to The Blouse was Ryoko Volume 1 by Eldo Yoshimuzi, I think is how you say his name, he is Japanese. This was originally published in 2011 in Japanese and was translated to English in 2019. Based on a write-up at the end of this graphic novel, it sounds like the author is an artist in most of his day-to-day life, and the main character of this graphic novel, Ryoko, was a character that ended up continually coming up in a lot of his art pieces. And so he decided to create a graphic novel around her, a story, a backstory, and honestly I think it would have been better if he left her in his individual art pieces. The graphic novel itself is pretty rough and incoherent most of the time. We're supposed to be following our main character Ryoko, a high-ranking Japanese mafia boss who is stationed in the Middle East. In this story there are assassination attempts fighting against a nebulous government, copious shootout and action scenes that don't usually have a point, secret princesses, all of it, what I could piece together what was going on, felt like a very cheesy B-rate action movie. And there are so many convoluted action sequences, and all of the women are running around in bikinis and cowboy boots, shooting guns, for some reason. We jump forwards and backwards in time for flashbacks to backstories that don't really have rhyme or reason. The flow of the art itself is also not very good. There were some panels where I stopped and thought, hey, that looks really nice, but the majority of them, especially the action sequence ones, again, were very convoluted. It was very difficult to tell what was going on. More often than not for action sequences, there were just big splashes of ink everywhere and it was just very dark. You couldn't tell what was going on. Very hard to follow. This was definitely not my cup of tea and I think I gave it 0.5 out of 5 stars. Next up, let's talk about Abbott 1973 by Saladin Ahmed with Sami Kivelä as the illustrator. Now, Abbott Volume 1 was one of my favorite books, one of my favorite graphic novels that I read last year, and sadly this was quite a bit of a letdown from that one. This volume came out in 2021, a year after the first volume came out. This volume just did not live up to the hype and the caliber of the first volume, unfortunately for me. The first volume felt so well plotted, so well paced, just masterfully done. As far as storytelling goes, as far as the art style goes, this second volume just felt a little bit all over the place and way less structured, way less cohesive than the first volume, and overall just felt much weaker. This volume leans a lot heavier into the superhero dynamic, which in general just isn't my thing, but in this case there really was no narrative explanation, backstory for how Elena, our main character's powers worked, other than that she just had to believe in herself, which in general I think is a great message to be putting out there. I just don't think it was done in a comprehensive and believable way for this story. In the end, I ended up giving this volume a 2.5 out of 5 stars, and I'm kind of hesitant to pick up any future volumes. The last graphic novel that I'm going to talk about was definitely a lot more enjoyable than the previous 3 that I have mentioned, and that was Catboy by Benji Nate. This was originally published in 2017 and is a very cute, fluffy, episodic graphic novel about a girl named Olive who is rather lonely and one night wishes on a shooting star that her cat could become a human who is her friend, but her wish doesn't turn out the way that she envisioned, and next morning she wakes up to find a human-sized cat next to her. Her cat Henry has been turned into a cat boy and they end up going on little misadventures. The art in this graphic novel is definitely gorgeous and very colorful, and the fashion of both Olive and Henry is really fun. This graphic novel definitely reminded me a little bit of Bee and Puppy Cat minus the intergalactic adventures that happen in that show, but if you're a fan of that, I think you would definitely enjoy this. This graphic novel is a collection of the ongoing weekly comic series of this storyline that comes out on Vice, plus some content that is exclusive to this graphic novel, as well as previously unreleased material and sketchbook pages from the artist. This was definitely very cute, very wholesome. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Okay, my friends, let's start talking about the fiction books that I read. All of the fiction books that I read this past month were definitely worlds better than the graphic novels that I ended up reading. I definitely had a month where I had reads on both ends of the spectrum, ones that I really did not get along with, really did not like, and some new favorite books. So let's get into it, let's talk about it. The first book that I'm going to mention is The Six Gun Tarot by R.S. Belcher. This was first published in 2013 and is the first in the Golgotha series of books. I picked this book up when I felt myself sliding into a little bit of a reading slump and needed a bit of a pick-me-up, and I listened to the audiobook of this, which was really fantastic. The voice actor for this audiobook did a really fantastic job with voicing the many characters that are in this book and giving each of them an individual voice and narration style. I would describe this as a dark historical fantasy set in the American West in 1869. The story itself revolves around a large cast of characters in a small town called Golgotha in Nevada, which is self-described as a safe haven for the blessed and the damned. Golgotha itself is a town in the middle of the desert that somehow repeatedly ends up attracting the odd, the magical, the otherworldly, often unknowingly. Strange things start to happen in Golgotha when a group of new prospectors decide to open up the silver mine in the hills above the town and unknowingly unleash something ancient and terrible into the midst of Golgotha. Overall, I would say I really did enjoy this book, the atmosphere, the characters. It was definitely the fantastical, adventurous escape that I needed to mentally pull myself out of the pending reading slump on the horizon. If I was to give it a small critique, I would say that for me personally, there were so many different backstories, characters, narrations, motivations that were pulled into this story that for me, I think I would have preferred if the number had been pared down a little bit so that you could get a greater focused, nuanced exploration of some characters' backgrounds, motivations, and stories, and being able to delve a little bit below the surface level examination of some of the themes that run throughout this book. In the end, I think that everything did definitely end up working together. It was more so a desire to have a bit more depth and nuance in the backstories of some of the characters. Ended up giving this book 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next up, let's talk about The Glass Town Game by Catherine M. Valente. This was originally published in 2017. This is a really fantastic middle grade book, though I would say on the upper end of middle grade, just based on some of the themes that are in this book. A fantastical adventure of the 4 Bronte siblings as they are sucked into the magical world of their own creation, Glass Town, based on the fictional creation of the actual Bronte siblings called Glass Town. I will leave a link to the Wikipedia article talking about it in the doobly-doo if you're interested. There are so many nods to and anecdotes from the actual works of Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte, and Anne Bronte. Catherine M. Valente is one of my favorite authors, and as always, her writing is spectacular. Her prose are lush and fantastical, as well as dark and witty. The plot itself is definitely a bit surreal, with characters made out of book pages, wood, flowers, and metal, dictators riding fire-breathing chickens, and a suitcase that can turn into Westminster Abbey. If you're a fan of the Mirror Traveler series by Christelle Debeau, I think you would really enjoy this. It has a similar level of surrealism and fantastical world building as that series does. And of course, Valente's writing is just gorgeous, and I love the way that she writes her characters. I think she does a fantastic job with her 4 child narrators in this book. Ended up giving this one 4.75 out of 5 stars. Next up, we have A Certain Smile by Francois Sagan. This originally was published in 1955 and translated into English in 1956. This is Sagan's second novel, published just a year after her first novel came out at age 18, which was Bonjour Tristesse. And you can see even in the span of a year between these 2 books that she is definitely developing as an author. There are definitely parallels between Bonjour Tristesse and A Certain Smile, which I think is why quite often the 2 are published bound up in the same volume, at least in English. A Certain Smile is the story of a young college girl named Dominique who finds herself attracted to her boyfriend's melancholic academic uncle and embarks on an affair with him. She knows that the affair is only temporary, that in reality it can only end in heartbreak, and yet she rushes headlong towards it. Having never had her heart broken before and being unaware of its devastation. This is a story much like Bonjour Tristesse about the folly and cruelty of youth, narrated from inside the mind of a young, precocious, nihilistic woman on the brink of adulthood. Like the protagonist of Bonjour Tristesse, Dominique struggles to fill the space in between her present self and the carefree woman that she pretends and wants to be. Dominique unwittingly begins to fall in love with her older paramour and begins to unravel into an obsession that begins to collapse her life around her into a single point, this man Luke. One critique that I will give of Sagan's work is definitely from a modern perspective on this older work that came out in the 50s, and that is the men in her stories can get away with murder. And by murder, I mean literally anything and not be held accountable. And the attitude of the women and the narration in these books is that boys will be boys, which is just very frustrating. But I will say that Sagan does a phenomenal job at character studies and often provides really remarkable and painful insights into the mindset and the trials and tribulations of youth. The progression of Dominique falling in love with Luke and her falling into this spiral of obsession is agonizing to read about, but also you can't stop reading. While I definitely have modern critiques of Sagan's work, I am continually blown away by it. I gave this book 4.75 out of 5 stars. Next up, let's talk about This Is Not a Book About Benedict Cumberbatch, The Joy of Loving Something, Anything Like Your Life Depends on It by Tabitha Caravan. That was a mouthful of a title, and this came out last year in 2022. I picked this book up somewhat ironically when I saw it on display in my local library. I was a huge BBC Sherlock and Benedict Cumberbatch fan back in the 2010s on Tumblr, and thought that this might be a snarky, fun little trip down memory lane and a good laugh. This book wound up being way more profound and ended up coming for my neck pretty hard, way more than I expected it to. This is a series of essays, memoir, reflections from Tabitha Caravan about motherhood and reclaiming identity within motherhood, maintaining a sense of self within motherhood, fangirls and cringe culture, and the ability to, especially as women, openly and unapologetically love something without fear of shame. I thought that this was a really fantastic nonfiction read, and I would highly encourage you to pick it up, even if you don't care for Benedict Cumberbatch, even if you don't even know who that is. It's certainly very thought-provoking in its discussions of pleasure and enjoyment and being open about that without shame, especially as a woman. This book and the final two that I will talk about in this video were 5 out of 5 star books for me. I was very lucky to read 3 5-star books this month. Next up, I listened to the audiobook of Just Kids by Patti Smith. This was originally published in 2010, and I feel like it does not need much of an introduction. This is Patti Smith's well-known, well-loved memoir about her metamorphic friendship, her artistic relationship with fellow artist Robert Mapplethorpe. Just Kids recounts both of their childhoods and their initial meeting in New York City in the 1960s, and from there their evolution as individual artists and their catalytic relationship that set them both on the path to fame. I'm certainly not the first person to say this, nor will I be the last, but Patti Smith is an incredible writer, and this is just beautifully written. I felt so honored to get to read this and get to experience the portrait that Patti Smith was painting of these two young artists in their early years, in their hungry years, before they started to receive wider recognition and fame for their work, where in a lot of cases they didn't have much more than each other and the insatiable desire to create. Just Kids starts as a love story and ends as a eulogy. It also serves as a salute to New York City in the late 60s and 70s, to its rich and its poor, its hustlers, its hellion, and most importantly, the life and memory of her beloved friend, Robert Mapplethorpe. I will definitely be checking out more Patti Smith as soon as I can. And the last and final book that I will talk about in this wrap-up is No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood. I was honestly blown away after having listened to the audiobook of Just Kids and thought, nothing else can top this month. Well, this book came along and just utterly shattered me, broke me open, made me a new person. If you're interested in watching the journey I had while reading this book, I will link the latest reading vlog that I did where I read this book, talked about it. I'll link that up in the cards if you're interested. Personally, I think I'm still reeling a little bit in the afterglow of this book. I will say up front, I don't think that this book is going to be everyone's cup of tea. It leans very heavily into the language and widespread collective internet humor that has developed over the last 15 years or so. If you're not someone who interacts heavily with social media or the internet, I think a good chunk of this is going to go over your head. That being said, if you are like myself, someone who grew up chronically online, if in many ways you have had your sense of humor and identity shaped by the absurdist nature and humor of social media and the internet, I think you'll get a kick out of this book. No One Is Talking About This is written in a very experimental, fragmented, omniscient, abstract style that in many ways reflects the ephemeral nature of sites like Tumblr and Twitter, who despite this have managed to compile long-standing community cultures and lore. None of the characters in this book have names. It's written from a first-person perspective, and everyone else is referred to by titles like my husband, my sister, my mother, etc. The main character is someone who, at the beginning of the book, is incredibly linked into what is known as the Portal, an unnamed social media site which honestly highly resembles Tumblr and or Twitter, that has constant streams of information that inform and shape the collective community, but how in the end the community of the internet interacts with and responds to all of these personal realities and morphs them into a collective reality. How memes and absurdist humor can have a longer lifespan in our psyche than quote-unquote actual realities. Our protagonist's career on the internet started when her post asking if a dog could be twins goes viral, and since then she's been speaking on panels and traveling the world talking with other creators, other internet personalities about the future and present of the portal. In the midst of this whirlwind, she gets a text from her mother saying that something has gone wrong and asking when she can come home. Her collective internet reality is shattered and stripped from her in the face of a family crisis where her sister is pregnant with and gives birth to a baby that is diagnosed with Proteus syndrome. Our protagonist's reality shifts and reforms around the bubble of her sister and this new baby, and doing everything that she can to help care for and enrich her niece's short-lived life. Something that definitely struck me about this book is that the author, Patricia Lockwood, expertly plays with the nuance of collectivist humor and identity that have come out of the age of the internet and social media. It's not a commentary on the morality of social media and the internet. It's just an exploration of what is, which I really appreciated. I'm really quite tired of encountering stories and narratives about the internet and social media that paint it as purely evil, that it is a sign of the degradation of society and morality. I think we deserve to have way more nuance in that discussion because the reality itself is rather nuanced. I think that No One Is Talking About This does a really phenomenal job of not moralizing the existence of social media, but merely observing the reality of it and how far its reach has come into the lives of the characters in the book as they move through a rather difficult period in their lives. No One Is Talking About This is so far easily my favorite book of the year. I'm not sure what else could top it, but I'm very excited to see what comes up in the next couple months of reading. If you have read any of these books, I would love to hear what you thought of them in the comments below. If you like this video, feel free to give it a thumbs up. It definitely helps my channel grow, and I really appreciate it. I hope you all are doing well, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.